Welcome to part 12 of Buddhism. This covers the history of modern Buddhism, which corresponds to the last 200 years or so of Buddhist history. An important element in the history of modern Buddhism is the spread of Buddhism to Europe, the United States, and other Western countries. The spread of knowledge of Buddhism started in the 19th century through the work of British and French scholars who were studying and translating Buddhist scriptures such as the Pali Canon and also the Mahayana scriptures of East Asia. Another important event was the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago in 1893, which was a part of the World's Fair held there. People of different religions from all around the world gathered and taught other people about their religion. And there were representatives of Buddhism from countries such as Japan and Sri Lanka. In the late 19th and early 20th century, many Westerners became interested in Theravada Buddhism specifically. Theravada was thought of at the time as a more kind of like traditional version of Buddhism, closer to the Buddha's teachings than Mahayana, which was regarded as more ritualistic. Now, there are rituals in both Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism. However, Theravada, you could say in some sense, is closer to the early form of Buddhism practiced maybe the first few centuries after the death of the Buddha. And they do prioritize the Pali Canon as opposed to later Buddhist texts. One example of the interest in Theravada Buddhism was the Pali Text Society that was founded by the British scholars T.W. Rice Davids and his wife Caroline Augusta. So this was an organization dedicated to printing modern editions of the Pali Canon. They also created and printed English translations of the Pali Canon. Another example of interest in Theravada Buddhism was Western monks from countries such as England and Germany moving to Sri Lanka to study Buddhism and to become ordained as monks there. There were a tiny number at the time, but this is when Western Buddhist monasticism began. And T.W. Rice Davids and his wife were both Theravada Buddhists. They were converts. And there was a small circle of Theravada Buddhists in Great Britain at the time and a few other Western nations. A larger wave of conversions or studying of Buddhism happened in the early 20th century with regards to Japanese Zen Buddhism. There's a Japanese scholar of Zen who was named Daisetsu T. Suzuki. He wrote a series of books and articles in English that explained Zen to a Western audience. This started before the Second World War, but interest in those books and in Zen Buddhism generally picked up after the Second World War. Before the Second World War, there weren't really many Western students of Zen in Japan, but that became more common after the war ended. And so you got some people both from the United States and other countries traveling to Japan to study Zen. And there were also Japanese Zen teachers who traveled to the United States and other Western countries. Another example of the influence of Zen Buddhism on Western culture was during the 1950s and 1960s with the counterculture movement. In the 1950s, there was kind of like an earlier version or harbinger of the 1960s counterculture in the beat poets such as Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac. Several of them became interested in Zen Buddhism. They looked at Zen as a kind of non-theistic religion that might be more compatible with a modern worldview. So they were kind of looking at Zen through the lens of Buddhist modernism. And that interest in Zen, because of the cultural influence of the beat poets and the later counterculture of the 1960s, the interest in Zen and Buddhism generally spread throughout the population. Another example was Alan Watts. He was an Englishman who was interested in Zen, but also in Taoism and Vedanta, and he wrote popular explanations of these religious traditions in English for a general audience. A kind of third wave of Buddhism in the West was Tibetan Buddhism. So this became more widely known in the 1960s and after. After many Tibetan Buddhist monks fled the province of Tibet in China because the autonomy of Tibet as a part of China largely ended in the 1950s. The Dalai Lama, who was the head of government traditionally in Tibet, Tibet was a part of the Chinese Empire, and then later the Republic of China, but practically speaking, they had a lot of freedom to govern their own affairs until the 1950s. And so as a result of the People's Republic of China taking more direct control of the province of Tibet, there was a kind of exodus of Tibetan monks outside of China to the west, and that picked up in the 1960s. An example of their influence is the Naropa Institute, which is a Buddhist university in Colorado, and that was founded by a lineage of Tibetan Buddhism called the Kargyas. There's also a term used by scholars, ethnic Buddhism. This was another way that Buddhism spread to the West. It's by the practice of Buddhism by ethnic minorities in Western countries that were from Buddhist cultures. So for example, there's a population of Thai Buddhists in Southern California, and some people who live in Southern California would learn about the religion through them. So that's an example of the spread of Buddhism to the West via ethnic Buddhism. Buddhism in India declined, especially after 1000 AD or CE. And there were several reasons for this. Devotional Hinduism became increasingly popular both among rulers and among commoners. Another factor was that devotion to the Buddha could be reincorporated into Hinduism, in that many Hindus regard the Buddha as an incarnation of Vishnu. So people who regarded themselves as followers of the Buddha might be able to combine that with Hinduism. Another factor which was quite important was that one of the most important financial supports for ancient Buddhism in India was a class of merchants who were Buddhist. And these were replaced by Muslim merchants starting in the several centuries before 1000 CE. And then kind of the final blow was Muslim armies, which invaded from what's now Afghanistan, and this is after 1000 CE. They basically destroyed the last few centers of Buddhism in India, which were the monasteries. So Buddhism did survive a little bit in India or South Asia, mainly in the Himalayan mountains. So if you look at the modern nations of Nepal and Bhutan, there are significant numbers of Buddhists there who practice Vajrayana Buddhism, as well as some of the parts of India that are in the Himalayan mountain range. So there was kind of like a pocket of Buddhism that survived in the far north of India. In the last couple of centuries, there's actually been a bit of a revival of Buddhism in India. It's still just a tiny percentage of the population who identify as Buddhists. But for one thing, a lot of the old monuments and pilgrimage sites of Buddhism were restored by an organization called the Mahabodhi Society, starting in the 19th century. During British rule of India, there were some archaeologists who rediscovered some of the early stupas and other sacred sites of Buddhism, and this society helped restore them as centers of pilgrimage. So you get Buddhists from other countries visiting India, and many of them established monasteries or little temples around those sacred sites. Another way that Buddhism was revived in India was that some Dalits, this is the lowest caste of Hinduism, sometimes called untouchables, because of the traditional belief that they were so impure that you should not touch them. They prefer the term Dalit, but some of them in the 20th century and after have converted to Buddhism from Hinduism. One of the founders of the independent nation of India, B.R. Ambedkar, was born into the Dalit caste, and he was adopted by a Brahmin, received an education, became a prominent intellectual, leader of the Indian independence movement. He was one of the main authors of the Indian Constitution. but he was very upset at the treatment of Dalits in Hindu society. So towards the end of his life, he converted to Buddhism and encouraged many of his followers to do so as well. They practice a kind of distinct version of Buddhism, somewhat influenced by Theravada Buddhism, but they tend to emphasize their opposition to Brahmanistic religion, to the Brahmin caste, and they actually regard Ambedkar as a really important source of Buddhist teachings, even though he was never ordained as a monk. You can see the picture on the right is an icon of Ambedkar, who's shown receiving the Dharma of the Buddha and transmitting it to his followers. And then the last type of Buddhism in India is Tibetan Buddhism. There were some Tibetans from the government of Tibet who left after China took more central control of the province. They left Tibet with the Dalai Lama at their head in 1959 and settled in Dharamsala, India. So there's a small community of Tibetan Buddhists and their followers there. Buddhism is still the main religion in Sri Lanka, an island off the south coast of India. Sri Lanka was part of the British Indian territories in the 1718 and early 1900s. Towards the end of the 19th century, there was a revival of Theravada Buddhism in the island of Sri Lanka. This was partly in reaction to some Christian missionaries who traveled to Sri Lanka from Great Britain. There were also some Christian missionaries active in other parts of India. They did have some converts to British forms of Protestant Christianity. However, Christians represent a small minority of the population of Sri Lanka. The majority of people remain Buddhist. One element of the revival of Buddhism, interestingly, was created by theosophists. Theosophy is a modern Western religion founded in the late 1800s by Helena Blavatsky. She was kind of like a Russian mystic, but the theosophists combine Buddhist teachings with those of Hinduism and Western mysticism. But because of their interest in Buddhism, some of their early members sought to protect it in Sri Lanka. So they established organizations such as the YMBA, Young Men's Buddhist Association. This was modeled after the Young Men's Christian Association. And the basic idea is that it provides a way for young Buddhist men to learn a bit about the religion and to kind of get a background in it, so they'll support it as lay people as they get older. So this was part and parcel of this modern approach to Buddhism, where lay people become more prominent. They take more of a leadership role or an active role in supporting the religion. Also, because of the revival of Buddhism in Sri Lanka, there were monks from other countries, including Western countries like England and Germany, who were ordained and trained in Sri Lanka. So even though the majority of the population is Buddhist, there are lots of other religious minorities in Sri Lanka. And Buddhism became entwined in conflict between different ethnic groups. The majority population is called Sinhala in ethnicity. Their language is actually derived from Sanskrit. There is also a large minority of Tamils who speak a Dravidian language, the same language Tamil that's spoken in the state of Tamil Nadu in southeastern India. Most of the Sinhalas are Buddhists, whereas most of the Tamils in Sri Lanka are Hindu. And there was a civil war between Hindu Tamils and Buddhist Sinhalas that lasted from 1983 to 2009. The Tamils regarded themselves as a persecuted minority that were discriminated against by the government, which was dominated by Sinhalas. And because the Sinhala ethnicity was associated with Buddhism, Buddhism became part of this war in a sense. There were Buddhist monks in Sri Lanka that were openly supporting the government's war against the Tamil Tigers, which was the main rebel group of the Tamils seeking independence. The war ended in 2009 when the last of the Tamil Tigers were basically destroyed by the army of Sri Lanka. However, since then, there's been additional tensions between Buddhists and Muslims in Sri Lanka. Muslims are a small minority. They're in certain enclaves along the coasts. But there were rumors spread via social media that some Muslims were seeking to harm Buddhists. Like one example of this is a Muslim-owned pharmacy that was accused of passing out contraception to their Buddhist customers to prevent them from having children, with the goal that the Muslims would eventually take over the island. This was a complete lie, but many Buddhists and Halas believed it, and there were riots and some people were hurt or killed in 2018. And it shows you that Buddhism, even though one of the main principles is nonviolence, that's one of the 5 precepts, it does often get entangled in these ethnic wars where religion becomes a marker of ethnic identity. Another Buddhist country, this one in Southeast Asia, is Burma, now known as Myanmar. Burma was a British colony between 1824 and 1948. They attained independence around the same time as India after the Second World War. Burma became a center for teaching of meditation in modern times. There's a type of Buddhist meditation called Satipatthana, or mindfulness meditation, and many Western teachers of meditation were originally trained in Burma, or they were trained by people who were trained in Burma. Burma became ruled by a military government starting in 1962. There was basically a coup d'etat, but generals took over. At the beginning and through most of this period, Buddhist monks in Burma mostly supported the government, even though it was an authoritarian military government. However, later on, the monks did join popular protests against the excesses of military rule, which included a lot of civil rights violations, accusation of torture, and so on. So once this happened, it may have helped force the hand of the military government to open up to more democratic rule. Now, the military still has a big hand in the government of Myanmar. However, they have a parliament now that's elected, and so they've done some sharing of their power with this elected parliament. An example of this is that a prominent democracy activist, a former basically enemy of the military government, Aung San Suu Kyi, she was allowed to run for office, and she's currently the head of government in Myanmar. She claims to have been influenced by Buddhism in her support for democracy and civil rights. However, she has since been criticized for not opposing the military's action against a Muslim minority in Western Burma called the Rohingyas. The Rohingyas are Muslim. They're believed by a lot of Burmese to not be real Burmese, to be immigrants or foreigners. And in this conflict, their Muslim religion is part of the reason why they're perceived as foreign, because the majority of Burmese are Buddhist, and they regard that as part of their identity. So there have been some killings of civilians among the Rohingyas. Many of them have had to flee to neighboring Bangladesh. There's also a layperson movement called 969, which is basically using Buddhist identity as a way of advocating for this persecution of the Rohingyas. The picture on the right shows Aung San Suu Kyi with the Dalai Lama, who is another political figure who's basically used religion as part of a political struggle. Thailand is another country in Southeast Asia that's very Buddhist. Thailand was the only country in Southeast Asia never to be colonized by a European power. They're technically a Buddhist kingdom, although the king does not wield much actual power. He's a symbol of the Thai nation, similar to the monarchs of the United Kingdom. However, historically, the kings of Thailand have played a very important role in Buddhism there. They're still regarded as protectors and promoters of the Buddhist religion. An example of their role is King Rama IV, who ruled Thailand from 1824 to 1851. He was actually a monk for over 20 years before he became king. He was a younger son of the previous king and was not originally expected to inherit the throne, so his original vocation was to be a monk. However, even after he became king, he was still interested in Buddhism, and he wanted to reform the orders of monks there because he thought many of them had become somewhat corrupt or undisciplined or not very educated in the Dharma. he created a new branch of monks called the Tamayut Nikaya. And they focused on studying the Pali Canon as well as enforcing the monastic discipline in a more traditional way. This king, incidentally, was the historical basis for the character of the Thai king in the famous musical The King and I. In Thai Buddhism, even today, reverence for the king is very much associated with Buddhist piety, being a good Buddhist. You can see an example of this in the picture on the right, a portrait of the previous king, Bhumibol, in Wat Thai Temple in North Hollywood, California. This is a Thai Buddhist temple. And Bhumibol in particular was a prominent supporter of Buddhism, and many Thais believe him to be someone who was an ideal Buddhist monarch. He lived according to Buddhist values. He's perceived as someone who really helped out the people. His son, King Maha Vajiralongkorn, enshrined his relics on October 29, 2017, after his passing. And this shows you that the relics of a king have a religious significance in Thai Buddhism. Another point I'll note about the picture on the right is you can see some dollar bills sticking out from behind that portrait. That's actually bills attached to what's called a bunny tree. This is a way of giving dana or offerings in some forms of Buddhism, to basically clip or attach your money to a kind of tree. It's a way of raising donations among lay people to help support the monks of that monastery. Another really important aspect of Thai Buddhism is something called the Thai forest tradition. This is not super well known outside of Thailand. It's not even the most prominent type of Buddhism in Thailand, but it has had a big influence. This was an attempt to reform Buddhism, to take it back to its roots. It's almost a kind of like fundamentalist type of Buddhism, in a sense. It was founded by someone named Ajahn Mun Buridatta. Ajahn means teacher in Thai, was interested in practicing meditation very seriously, with the goal of attaining awakening, if possible, in this lifetime. Even though that's the goal of Buddhism, this was regarded as somewhat eccentric or odd in late 19th century Thailand. Many people believed then, as do many still today in Thailand and other Buddhist countries, that because it's been so long since the Buddha's awakening, the Dharma has fallen into decline. And you cannot really understand the Buddha's Dharma well enough to attain enlightenment, at least not straight away. So many Buddhists have this idea it's more realistic to strive for a good rebirth by having good karma. And also at the time, meditation was not being that seriously practiced by many monks in Thailand. So Ajahn Mun decided to be self-reliant. He went out into the wilderness to practice meditation for long periods on his own, and he was guided, in addition to by his own experience, he was guided by a close reading of the Pali Canon. And so in the Thai forest tradition, they tend to read the Pali Canon on its own and don't exclusively rely on the traditional Theravada commentaries in order to interpret those texts. Ajahn Mun was followed by Ajahn Lee Damodaro, and together they established this kind of lineage or tradition of so-called forest monks. These are people who tend to practice meditation for long periods in the wilderness or places on the edge of civilized areas. They've had a lot of Western students and have since spread to other countries as well, such as the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. Cambodia was a Buddhist kingdom under French colonial rule from 1863 to 1953. After the French were kicked out in 1953, eventually there was a government established called the Khmer Rouge. This was led by Pol Pot, and he had this kind of odd vision of restoring his idealized version of the ancient Khmer kingdom of Cambodia. This included the destruction of anything he regarded as not authentically Cambodian, which included Buddhism. So he murdered a lot of Buddhist monks, destroyed monasteries. Buddhism was almost completely wiped out during the period of the Khmer Rouge rule from 1975 to 1979. The rule of the Khmer Rouge only ended when an army from Vietnam occupied Cambodia in 1979. They were concerned about how unstable that country was becoming. It was influencing their country as well, so they intervened militarily. Eventually, a more stable government was established in Cambodia, and they restored the monarchy in 1993. As in Thailand, the monarch is regarded as a symbol of the traditional Cambodian culture, but also protecting Buddhism specifically. Despite the fact that Buddhism was severely damaged by the Khmer Rouge, today 96% of Cambodians identify as Theravada Buddhists, or Buddhists primarily Theravada. It's more common custom in Cambodia to ordain as a monk temporarily. You see this in other Southeast Asian countries as well, such as Thailand and Burma. Young men will ordain as monks to create good merit for themselves and their family before joining the workforce or just the normal world and becoming householders. The picture on the right, you can see a group of adolescent monks in Cambodia in the Angkor Wat temple complex. Laos was another former French colony, attained independence in 1953. A communist government was established. However, Buddhism, even though it is opposed by the communist ideology, which is atheist and materialist, the majority of people in Laos still identify as Theravada Buddhist, 66%. And also, Theravada Buddhism is often mixed or combined with animistic folk religions. An example of an animistic folk religion native to Laos is Uadab, which is the religion of the Hmong people. Hmong people actually live in a couple of other Southeast Asian countries as well, in the hilly or mountainous regions. And so some people combine Theravada Buddhism with these forms of animism, although some people only practice Uadab on its own. The picture is of a Buddhist temple at the former royal palace in Luang Prabang in Laos. The monarchy was abolished, so it no longer exists in Laos, but this is still a kind of important historical and also religious site in Laos. In Vietnam, they practiced a form of Mahayana Buddhism influenced by Chinese Mahayana. So there are Vietnamese versions of Chinese Buddhist sects, like Tien is the Vietnamese version of Chan Buddhism, and Tin Do is the Vietnamese version of Jing Tu, or Pure Land Buddhism. So the French ruled Vietnam from 1862 to 1946. They attained independence after the Second World War. However, they had to fight for independence from France for many years, from 1946 to 1954. The independence movement was led by Ho Chi Minh, who became aligned with the communists, especially after the Second World War. The United States was afraid of communist influence in Southeast Asia. So after the French left Vietnam in 1954, the United States began to intervene and fought against the communist rebels in the north of Vietnam, and later on the communist government in North Vietnam. So even though this was an independence movement in the United States, they were associating with the spread of communism, and they intervened militarily, although the United States was ultimately defeated. So the Vietnam War really stressed out the country, including Buddhism. There was a lot of disruption, not only because the communist government in the North was very anti-religion in general because of the ideology of Marxism, which is atheist and materialist, but also just because of the disruptions of the war itself. Also in South Vietnam, which was the part of Vietnam supported by the United States before it fell to North Vietnam in 1975, the president, Ngo Dinh Diem, was Catholic, and he was accused by many Buddhists of discriminating against them. Catholics were a small minority in Vietnam. Catholicism had basically spread there as a result of the French colonial rule. Some of the people who became part of the colonial administration and the elite class went to school in French Catholic schools. They learned the French language. They got a Western education, but they were also brought up Catholic, many of them. And so Ngo Dinh Diem was filling his government with Catholics, basically, at the expense of Buddhists. So Thich Nhat Hanh is an example of a famous Vietnamese Buddhist. He actually had to leave Vietnam for political reasons, and he settled in France, where he created a monastery called Plum Village. He has since written many books and articles in English and published in other Western languages too. And he's gained a lot of followers among Western Buddhists and also just kind of spread knowledge of Buddhism in the West. He was also an example of an engaged Buddhist. This means someone who tries to use Buddhism for political activist purposes to reform society, end abuses against civil rights, and so on. And he was in part of the peace movement in the 1960s, trying to bring an end to the war in Vietnam. Tibet has been a part of the Chinese Empire for many centuries, going back to the Yuan dynasty established by the Mongols. However, even though they were a part of China, they had considerable autonomy in governing their affairs. The Mongol or Yuan dynasty had delegated the Dalai Lama as his governor in the province of Tibet, and that custom was carried over even after the Mongols were expelled from China. So Tibet was a part of China, but it had considerable autonomy under the Dalai Lama. This ended with the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, after the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong defeated the nationalists and took over control. So after 1950, the communist government wanted to have more control over all of China, including Tibet. And so Tibetan autonomy was basically gradually diminished in the period of 1950 to 1959. The Dalai Lama was still nominally in charge of Tibet, but he received increasing pressure from the Chinese government, and in 1959 he fled the country, left the province of Tibet, and settled in Dharamsala, India, including with some senior ministers of his government, other officials, and supporters. They created a government in exile in Dharamsala, so they still regard themselves as the legitimate rulers of Tibet, but that's disputed by the People's Republic of China. The Dalai Lama was traditionally one of the heads of a Tibetan Buddhist lineage. He's no longer the head of government in Tibet, but he's still regarded as kind of like a symbol both of Tibetan Buddhism generally and of the Tibetan people by many Tibetans. However, he's no longer even the official head of the government in exile. He transferred his political authority of this exiled government to an elected leader in 2011. Buddhist modernism is another very important development of Buddhism in the last couple hundred years. It really started in the late 1800s, both in the West and in Asia. Buddhist modernism attempts to combine Buddhism with a modern scientific worldview and modern social political values. An example of a Buddhist modernist is Walpola Rahula, who is a prominent monk from Sri Lanka. The picture shows you his book, What the Buddha Taught, which gave a summary of Buddhism mainly intended for Western audiences, but it was very much influenced by this philosophy. Now, Buddhist modernism basically started both among Western converts to Buddhism and also among Asian Buddhists who were trying to revive and reform the religion in the late 1800s. So it occurred simultaneously in both of those parts of the world. Buddhist modernists will often use Buddhist values like compassion, nonviolence, goodwill to try to justify equality under the law, democracy, civil rights, ending of the oppression of minorities, social justice, things like this. And that's definitely a modern take on Buddhism. I mean, on the one hand, you could say traditional Buddhism did emphasize the equality of humans in the sense that every human has a shot at attaining awakening that's comparable. However, in practice, they did not really dispute the social or political status quo much. The goal of Buddhism, nirvana, was thought of as a kind of otherworldly goal. So it didn't require social justice or the complete reform of society in order for you to attain nirvana. If anything, it was more of something you wanted to withdraw at least a bit from the world. Now, there are historical analogs to this concern with social justice. You can see the idea of a Chakravartin, or a king who protects the Dharma, and Ashoka the Great is often regarded as an example of that. But still, the manifestation of the idea of political and social justice in Buddhist modernism is a very modern phenomenon. There was also a version of this that developed in China called Humanistic Buddhism, or Renjian Fojiao. And this is based on the teachings of a Chinese Buddhist monk named Tai Shu, who similarly taught that Buddhism should focus a bit less on the afterlife and rebirth, and focus more on creating good conditions in the world as we know it. And this can draw inspiration from Buddhist values like compassion and nonviolence and so on. There's several different strands of Buddhist modernism. One example is engaged Buddhism. This is the type of Buddhist modernism that focuses on using Buddhist values to try to create social justice and reform society. An early example of an engaged Buddhist was Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese monk and peace activist. It's even more common now in the last few decades especially. So this term engaged Buddhism is not a sect or a branch of Buddhism. It's more of like a cultural movement that some Buddhists of different sects adhere to. Another strand of Buddhist modernism is called secular Buddhism. So this is the idea that all types of supernatural belief should be purged from Buddhism. This is including things like psychic powers, belief in reincarnation, of realms of rebirth, anything that's regarded as inconsistent with the scientific worldview. An example of a secular Buddhist is Stephen Batchelor. He was born in England. He ordained as a Korean Seon monk, and later on he left the monkhood and became both agnostic and advocates a secular approach to Buddhism. Another really important development in Buddhism is the growth of interest in meditation in the last 100 years or so. During the 1700s, meditation had started to largely decline in Theravada countries such as Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Burma. So it had to be self-consciously revived in the late 1800s. Monks before that time in Theravada countries mainly focused on chanting and rituals. Meditation did survive, though, in some other Buddhist traditions, like in Tibetan Vajrayana and Japanese Zen, for example, meditation was still widely practiced. But there was a big revival of meditation in Thailand, Sri Lanka, and Burma starting in the late 1800s. Vipassana is a particular style of meditation, also called insight meditation, that was the type of meditation developed in Burma starting in the late 1800s by people like Mahasi Sayadaw, shown in the picture on the right. According to insight meditation, they make a distinction between mindfulness and concentration and regard those as two distinct types of meditation. The Pali Canon itself seems to present them as going in tandem, that mindfulness is one of the foundations to help develop concentration or meditation. Mindfulness is when you keep the breath or some other object of meditation in mind, and if you do that, then that will naturally lead to concentration or a very focused, calm state of mind. However, according to Vipassana meditation, they say that mindfulness is a more kind of like open-ended meditation where you pay attention to the flow of experience in a kind of non-judgmental way. And they think this leads to greater insight than what they call concentration meditation, which is just trying to get the mind focused or stuck on one particular thought or object. In particular, the Burmese Satipatthana method emphasizes mindfulness of breathing as their main method. This has become very influential because some of the teachers of meditation in the West were trained in Burma by people who taught in this tradition. So a bit more about that revival of meditation. Zen had never died out, its meditation tradition, but it became more prominent in Western countries, both through the books of scholars like D.T. Suzuki and also, especially after the Second World War, when people traveled to and from Japan to learn Zen. Tibetan meditation also became known outside of Tibet, especially in the 1960s and after the government in exile was established in Dharamsala, India, because you had many prominent Tibetan Buddhist teachers fleeing the country. Some of them traveled to or even settled in Western countries such as the United States and taught Western students forms of Tibetan meditation such as Dzogchen. Dzogchen is a particular form of Tibetan Buddhist meditation in which, as I understand it, you kind of open your mind. You don't have a fixed object of focus. You're trying to realize straight away the mind of awakening, which is visualized as just a clear, bright awareness. And so that's basically what you let your mind become. So it's a kind of like a very direct meditation approach. It doesn't use the breath or some other object as an intermediary. Vipassana meditation, as I mentioned, became prominent in Burma, and an example of its spread to other countries was Goenka. Goenka was actually born in Burma. He was from an Indian family. He was a layperson, but he started studying the Vipassana meditation to deal with his migraines, but he found that it really transformed him deeply. So he was a businessman. He never became a monk. He was a layperson, but he made it his calling or mission to teach meditation in this Burmese style to lay people. And he ended up founding meditation centers dedicated to lay people, especially all around the world, where to this day they offer free retreats that you can go to learn about Vipassana meditation. The mindfulness movement is a name used to refer to this general loose movement, or a cultural wave, you might say, of teaching meditation outside of a Buddhist context oftentimes. This was started by some Westerners such as Jack Kornfield and Sharon Salzberg, who studied Vipassana meditation under Burmese teachers in the 1970s, and then brought it back. They founded the Insight Meditation Society, or IMS, in Barre, Massachusetts, and other places that founded since then include Spirit Rock in the Bay Area. Well, this has over time led to the diffusion of practice of mindfulness meditation throughout Western society and in Asian countries and all around the world, actually. And one of the aspects that's most noticeable about mindfulness meditation, the way it's taught in this movement, is that it's often taught in a secular context that's largely decoupled from Buddhism. Or if there are elements of Buddhism mentioned, it's in a kind of non-religious way, where meditation is regarded as just an aid to help make you happy and have well-being in this life. Another instance of the meditation revival was that of the Thai forest tradition. So you may recall these were the monks who were looking for enlightenment by practicing meditation very seriously. The Thai forest tradition teaches a type of meditation that's distinct from the Burmese Satipatthana method. They don't make a sharp contrast between mindfulness and concentration meditation. They regard them as two aspects of meditation. That mindfulness is the thing you develop that leads naturally to concentration. So their method seems to be a bit closer in that sense to what you see in the Pali Canon. Finally, a bit about the role of women in Buddhism today. The female order of nuns actually died out in Theravada Buddhist countries. This may have been in part because women in general were regarded as not the equals of men, so there tended to be less practical support given to them. However, the female Sangha did survive in Mahayana and Vajrayana countries, such as China, Korea, and Tibet, for example. Recently, there's also been somewhat of an attempt to revive the order of nuns in some Theravada countries, although this is controversial because, strictly speaking, it goes against the rules of the Pali Canon. The Vinaya, or the rules for the Sangha, requires that there be 5 ordained nuns to perform the ordination ceremony. Because the order died out, this created a chicken-egg problem, where there's no ordained nuns available to ordain new nuns. So there are many Theravada Buddhist teachers who say the order has died out and can never be revived. However, there have also been attempts to revive it by, for example, having Mahayana nuns ordain a Theravada nun. And there's some people who argue that monks should be able to ordain nuns as well. After all, the Buddha himself founded the order of nuns that way. More common, though, is for lay women to take vows similar to those of nuns and basically live the lifestyle of nuns. And sometimes they are regarded as teachers of the Dharma or meditation by other lay people in Southeast Asian countries, although that can be controversial. So despite the fact that there aren't that many Theravada nuns nowadays, there are still many Mahayana and Vajrayana nuns, and some of them have even become quite prominent in the popular culture. An example is the Tibetan Buddhist nun Pema Chodron. She was actually a Westerner, but she converted to Buddhism, and she's written several books about her understanding of Buddhism, and these have become quite popular. So nuns have played a role in the development of the increased awareness of Buddhism throughout the world. The picture on the right is a picture of an ordination of a bhikkhuni or nun in Sri Lanka. And the ordination ceremony for both monks and nuns involves the senior monk will actually shave the head of the monk or nun being ordained as a kind of symbol of their transition to this new life and this new status.